Welcome everyone to the Ontario Caregiver Organization's webinar series. These webinars bring together caregivers and subject matter experts to explore topics of interest to caregivers. We do this to support and engage chosen family members, friends, neighbors, really anyone who's caring for someone else. My name is Katie Muirhead, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. We begin this gathering by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today. While we meet on a virtual platform with people joining us from across the province, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. The land that I'm standing on today is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging this reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendships of Indigenous peoples. As team members at OCO, we are learning about the lands from which we work, exploring how we can be meaningful allies and how we can support the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. We invite you to take a moment to reflect on the land where you are. And if you're not familiar with that, we'll be sharing an interactive map that tells you which traditional territory your city or town sits on. And you can find that at native-land.ca. Our webinar today is called the 8 A's of Dementia. By understanding the reasons for the changes in behavior of a person living with dementia, caregivers can improve their skills to support and help the person make use of the remaining abilities. This webinar will give us some clues to understand the meaning behind the behaviors, and all of you will learn about the 8 A's of dementia and their impact on the failing brain. I'd like to introduce you to our speaker today. Josée Desrochers Leduc is the Education Coordinator for the Alzheimer Society Cornwall District. She's got extensive experience working in the healthcare system. In her role, she provides educational supports to people living with dementia, their families, caregivers, and healthcare professionals. Josée coordinates a variety of programs and has led educational workshops on various topics. She's very passionate about dementia care. Her goal is to educate more people about the impact of stigmatization on people living with dementia and their families. Welcome, Josée, take it away.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, everybody. Please bear with me. I do have a cold, so hopefully my voice will sustain throughout the presentation. So it's great to see you all on the platform today and wanting to learn a little bit more how to deal with the impact of dementia. So before we go ahead with the 8 A's of dementia, I just want to go over what is dementia. You know, we hear that term all the time. We hear the term Alzheimer's disease and things like that, terms like that. So it turns out that dementia is an umbrella term that refers to a variety of brain disorder. The most common type of dementia is Alzheimer's. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia. Dementia is not all about memory loss. It's also about perception, thinking, reasoning, judgment, loss of language, loss of concentration. So keep that in mind. It's not all about memory loss. So the 8 A's of dementia. So by understanding the reason for the changes in behavior of a person living with the disease or living with dementia, we can improve our ability to be a support and help the person make use of their remaining ability. People with the disease will not necessarily have all the 8 A's. It depends on the type of dementia. And keep in mind, there are over 100 types of dementia. All right. So I always add that slide to show people that every part of the brain have a function. So it's easier for you to understand that if there is some impairment on a particular part of the brain, there will be an impact on our overall behavior. Let's put it like that. So it's giving you an idea of the brain function. Okay. So let's start with the first A. The first A is Agnosia. Try to say that 3 times in a row. Not easy. So Agnosia is the loss of self-awareness. The person that has agnosia doesn't know what she doesn't know. That person is not aware that anything is wrong. They are unaware that they might not be well. Forget that they forget, so they blame other when things don't go right. Or as the example here, they may accuse other of stealing when they can't find something because they can, to them, there's a reason why they cannot find their keys is because someone stole them. So the approach for agnosia is definitely not to challenge and not to confront. Think of it this way: dementia equals brain failure, and the person is doing the best he or she can with what she has left. So she's using her or his remaining abilities to make sense of things. And people with dementia don't see the world the way we do. So the approach for agnosia would be validate their concern. Throughout the presentation, you're going to hear me say validate, 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 because to that person, that's what's making sense. Avoid challenging the person because they're losing or they have a loss of ability to recognize that something's wrong. You have to make sure that that person is safe. I'll give you an example. Sometimes people think they're well enough to go and cut the grass. And you know, as a caregiver, that they can't anymore and that it could be a danger. So sometimes we've got to hide the keys. Sometimes we've got to remove that particular trigger. Or you can have help, someone supporting that individual to do the task. Visual aids, very important as well. The second A is amnesia. Most of us know what amnesia means. We saw a movie, we hear of that term, but it's much more than not remembering. The person is forgetting people, places, and event. Short-term memory loss, normally first symptoms in Alzheimer's disease type dementia. They remember things from the past, long-term memory. So the new stuff is the first thing to go. The new memory are the first thing to go. They have trouble to put event in order. What happened before? What happened after? What's going to happen? What's happening next? It's a pathological forgetfulness. So the approach for that particular amnesia is keep a routine. Routine is so important among people living with dementia. Repeat as necessary, because think of it this way, to them, it's the first time they ask the question, or to them, it's the first time they've been repeating that question. And with amnesia, the person can no longer learn things. So new things that are happening in their life, they can't remember. All right. The third is aphasia. So aphasia is the loss of language. speaking and understanding. However, someone might still understand things, might lose the ability of speaking, but it doesn't mean that they don't understand. They just don't appreciate the fact that there is a sorry about that. Okay, let's start again. So aphasia is the loss of language, speaking, and understanding. Difficulty thinking of the right word. They might substitute word, using one word for another, putting words in the wrong order, trouble saying the words correctly. They may not take part in conversations. They sometimes withdraw because they cannot grasp everything people are saying around them. They may revert to first language, and we see that quite a bit. So the approach is use gesture and visual cues. Give direction clearly. Speak slowly. Use shorter phrases, or as I always say, use keywords. The important words that the person, it'll be easier for her to grasp the word if you use keywords. And use positive body language. Believe it or not, a person with dementia is so, she is a professional in non-verbal language. They rely a lot on our non-verbal language. The person with dementia may understand, but can't comprehend the consequences of her understanding. It's two different things, especially with people with frontal issues. Then we have agnosia, which is the loss of ability to recognize people, sound, object, and their purpose and meaning. They may misunderstand what they see or hear, or even taste. Confusing one object for another. You might ask that person to go and get a hammer, and they come back with a drill. The good news in that analogy is that they came back with a tool. That person knew it was a tool, but they have agnosia, so they didn't recognize exactly what it was. Loss of recognition of sensory information. It's a kind of a summary of what we just talked about. Sight, sound, taste, touch, or smell. So dementia has the ability to cause a decline in those areas. So the approach often is to introduce yourself. That's a big one, because first of all, you're helping the brain of the person not to be stressed, because a stressed brain, whoever we are, can't think properly. Often offer one item at a time, one thing at a time, and identify the thing. Demonstrate the use of the object. So a spoon, a fork, a knife, and often we can base our communication on other senses. The next one is apraxia. That is the loss of purposeful movement, trouble getting moving, loss of ability to plan, sequence, and execute steps, trouble understanding direction, up, down, back, front, left, right, coordination of movement, they put things in the wrong order. And a good example for that is the remote control. Sometimes early enough in the disease, people will say, gee, my loved one, he tries to change the channel and then he can't. He has apraxia, he or she's losing the ability to do that. Microwave. Someone that have been using microwave for a long time, then all of a sudden they click on buttons, and they often they really get frustrated because it's like their brain know, but they just can't do it. The approach is simplify the task, focus on one instruction at the time, demonstrate the action. And again, the use of keyword, it is so important. The next one is the altered perception. It's loss of perceptual ability, the ability to be able to deal with and give meaningful sensory stimuli. Misinterpretation of what is seen or heard may lead to delusion or hallucination, which is something that is not there. Loss of color and visual perception. As the disease progresses and during the journey, people tend to, because of the changes in the vision, people tend to mistaking one object for another, especially at the end of the afternoon when it's starting to be dark a little. Often they might have coats on a coat rack, and they might think that it is someone that is standing in the corner. That can cause actually a lot of fear. Or mirrors. They see themselves in the mirror, and who is that old person that is looking at me? Who is that person that is looking at me? What are they doing in my house? Because they live in the moment, but they're often in the past. Sometimes we do suggest to remove or to cover mirrors because that's very scary to them. Also, they see in 2 dimensions and not 3 dimensions. So things seems to be flat. Is it an apple or a picture of an apple? So often when they watch TV, depending on what they're watching, they might think that the person are actually there. Excuse me. The approach with altered perception would be visible large print signs. Be careful with contrast to highlights or diminish. Take a step back and look at what a person with dementia might see. And to help you, you could do something like this. And as the disease progresses, I don't have to tell you that it's getting way smaller and smaller up to the univision. So keep lights on and use dimmer, eliminate shadows. Often people might have issues with bathing their loved one. And as soon as they get in, they look at the bathtub, they don't see the depth of the water. So they think it's bottomless. Sometimes we suggest to put some bubble bath so they don't see, and things seems to be going much better. Often flooring too. If the flooring is very shiny, they might think the floor is wet. Or if it's square, let's say black and white, at one point there used to be a lot of floors like that. Well, the black tile is a hole. So they will be tiptoeing. The next one is apathy. That is the loss of initiation and motivation. That is actually the motor of initiation that is impaired. The person cannot get going. There's less motivation in doing things, less ability to get started on an activity, little or no emotional response, loss of interest in activity, seeming lack of empathy. They have a hard time seeing others' point of view. Often also people might say, well, I think my loved one is depressed. It might, definitely it might. But we say with the right approach and apathy, the person will gladly do the activity. As if someone is depressed, no matter what you try, it won't work. So we often instead of asking a person, would you like to go for a walk today? Especially when you know that person has apathy. Instead of saying that, say, come on, let's go for a walk today. It's beautiful. And by just saying that and doing kind of a motion with your nonverbal language, you will help. You will be able to help that person to get engaged in the activity. As I said, assist with task initiation. Keep activity props nearby, meaning the task to do. Offer verbal cues. This is what we're doing. Utilize, again, remaining strength. The last one, but not the least, we used to have 7 A's. Now we have 8, and it's called the attention deficit. That is the inability to sustain or shift attention. The person's focus is very, very limited. They're easily distracted or perseverate, get stuck, and can't switch. So they clean a table, they clean a table, they clean a table. And you might have to redirect in order for them to stop the activity. Repetitive action. Trouble keeping focus on one thing or changing focus from one thing to the other. An example on that one would be someone that has been asking to eat. The person's hungry, and you know the person is hungry. You give that person their food, and they're gonna sit for a few minutes, not even, and take a few bites, and then they're gonna get distracted by something else. Only the approach with attention deficit, only one person at a time speaking. Reduce distraction around the environment. We often suggest that to use smaller group visiting that individual. Present one item at the time. And again, by adapting the environment so that person can have a little bit more focus. So that's in your hands. You are the starter button for these things. So these are the 8 A's. So I just want to go over with what we've talked about today. I think now you may understand why the person may not understand, may not be able to make themselves understood, may not understand what is expected of them, because sometimes there's just too much information. And that person may misinterpret things. Important things to remember is that dementia is brain failure, and that the person living with dementia is doing the best he or she can with what they have left. So I am leaving you with this today, and this is our contact information along with Alzheimer Society of Ontario. Do not hesitate to reach out, to ask questions. We are here to support in any way that we can. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Josée. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing these really helpful insights, tools, and strategies to not only support, the person living with dementia, but their care partners as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. We have had lots of wonderful comments and questions coming through the chat. So as a reminder for folks, the recording of today's session will be sent to you. So you will get a copy of this recording. You'll get some resources that Josée will be sharing with us to pass along. So there's been lots of great feedback about, wow, I'd love to rewatch this or share it with somebody, or I can't write it down fast enough. So we are going to send that to you. So we can spend the time that we have left just sort of thinking and absorbing some of the information, I think. So if you have some questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And I guess what I'll do, Josée, is I'll start off with a question that came in pretty early on about the first A, and wondering if you can expand a bit more on some examples of visual aids that people could use in their spaces.
Sure, absolutely. That's a very good question. So visual aids would be in terms when you are the caregiver and the person with dementia, she's talking about agnosia, right? I just want to make sure that was the first A.
The first A.
Okay, so agnosia. So I'll give you an example, and that might be very helpful. Let's say your loved one has agnosia, so has no knowledge of the disease, but every time he goes to the sink, he leaves the water on. So if you're gone to work and you wash up in the morning, because the person is still able to do that, but never close. So we mentioned, how about you put a sign, but the sign is not for him, it's for you, the caregiver. And you say, okay, let's see, it's for me. Josée, do not forget to close the water, to shut off the water. So the person living with the disease will read that, but because he has no problem, he will shut off the water. So I hope that answers. We often, as caregiver, especially with that particular A, we have to apply the things to us. I can definitely send more information because we could talk about Agnosia for a long, long time, but just to give you an idea.
No, that's great. And I think that's one really great example of different communication strategies that we can use for our people living with dementia. But I love that you sort of used it as also a reminder for us as their caregivers, because sometimes it's about us modifying our behavior in order to support the person best. So we talked a little bit about some visual strategies, and there's also been some really great suggestions that folks have been putting through in the chat.
Oh, nice.
Yes, it's the chat box is very active right now, so I'm going to do my best to pay attention and keep up at the same time. But I'm wondering if you can expand on just more generally communication strategies as well. So we've talked a bit about some visual things, visual prompts and cues, but are there other communication strategies that you could suggest to support our audience today?
Yes, absolutely. Again, great questions. As a good communication tips, we have to make sure that we're not becoming the boss of someone that has dementia. You want to be an ally to that person and not a boss. So when you face that person, it's always very important not to be on top of that. I don't mean on top of that person, but I would normally demonstrate it if I was face to face with you, where you stand up, the person is sitting down, you stand up in front of the person and you're becoming his boss. He doesn't need a boss, or she doesn't need a boss. He needs an ally. So sometimes you have to sit and get the person's attention. Because as I mentioned before, the changes in the vision change. The person needs to see you. You need to connect. You need to connect with your loved one in order to be able to have them understand, or for you to be able to clue that person. I will send you some communication tips. It'll be much easier.
That's great. So for those that were asking about communication strategies, there'll be more tips to come with the email that we send out along with the recording of today's session. So yeah. Thank you. We have had a couple of questions come in around mobility, gait, balance, and just inquiries around like how common is that for a person with dementia? I think sometimes we think of this as a brain disorder that really affects our cognition or our speech, but I'm wondering if you can maybe elaborate a bit on how does dementia impact our physical functioning as well, like our balance, our gait, our mobility, things along those lines.
Good question. So, as of course, at the beginning of the disease, especially in Alzheimer's type dementia, the person is basically physically fit. The brain is failing, their cognition ability diminished. As the disease progresses, as I mentioned, dementia equals brain failure. And our brain is in charge of everything, is connected with our heart. It's in charge of everything. So as the disease progresses, the ability diminish, the mobility diminish. Also, I talked about the changes in the vision. So if I was going to ask each and every one to put your binocular vision, and I ask you to look around the room, tell me what you see. Tell me how easy it would be to walk. It's harder. Let me tell you, just look at your finger. You see the perception. So there's a couple of things. The disease progress, it impairs your mobility, but there are so many changes in everything else, including the vision.
Yeah, it's so important to remember that our brain controls everything we do. It controls the things we don't think about, like our breathing and our blinking. And it controls the things that we think a little too much about sometimes too, and everything in between.
We do take things for granted, right? Because it's something that is almost innate. But when you see ability change, and my mom is living with dementia, she is in long-term care. So I know how hard it is to see a loved one lose their abilities.
Yeah, it's certainly not an easy thing to watch. And we've had a lot of comments in the chat around that, around folks who have early onset dementia and seeing the changes in their partners or their family members or their friends who've gone through these things. It's very difficult to experience for sure.
Absolutely.
So I'm just scrolling through my handy dandy phone as my counterpart behind the scenes is quickly sending me all these wonderful questions. And I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit more about the piece around, this is probably a better question for everyone. Can those people suffering from dementia or a dementia-related diagnosis, Alzheimer's or other conditions that fall under the umbrella, can they have some of the symptoms of the A's, but maybe not all 8 A's? Is that something that can happen?
Absolutely, yeah. I would say most likely towards the end of the disease, the end of the journey, most likely people will be impaired, but not all of them. We just lost someone that to this day, till the last minute, she was still able to pay her bills, but couldn't do anything else.
Would you be able to maybe go into a little bit of the distinction between dementia and Alzheimer's, and maybe touch a little bit on some of the other diagnoses that fall under that umbrella? But I think the general public, we think of Alzheimer's disease or dementia, but we don't maybe have an awareness of the nuances or the differences between them, and that there are others that fall under that umbrella as well.
Absolutely. So there are over 100 types under the umbrella of dementia. The most common one being the Alzheimer's disease, dementia. And then we do see a lot of people with vascular dementia, which is triggered normally by a stroke or a series of stroke. So the part of the brain that was impacted by the stroke, that part, the cells are dying. So of course, depending where the stroke is, will depend on the symptoms that the person will have of dementia. Now, not everybody that had a stroke will end up with dementia. I just want to make that clear. And then one that is starting to be more and more common, but we just know a little bit more about it, is Lewy body dementia. For those who knew Robin Williams, that's what he had. He had Lewy body dementia. And that is often seen on people with Parkinson's disease. So it's often, they kind of hang out together, but not everybody that has Parkinson will have Lewy body dementia. The particularities of Lewy body dementia is people will get very, very stiff. Their walk is, they shuffle. And at the beginning, a long time ago, they used to call everything Alzheimer's type dementia. But they've seen some particularities that were different from one from the next. Lewy body often have hallucination about animals, people, person, and they're vivid. It's like they're living it. They're really, really vivid. Then you have mixed dementia, which is 2 or more dementia. So sometimes someone might start with vascular dementia, and at one point, they will be diagnosed with mixed, which Alzheimer's type dementia might be involved. There's alcohol-related dementia. There is frontal temporal dementia, which normally occur at a younger age. So that affects the frontal and the temporal lobe right here. So I hope that answers a little bit.
It really helps to bring some insight into how many different types of dementia there are, and that it's not just Alzheimer's or dementia. There's so many different types that have so many different impacts, and
Absolutely.
one not the same as necessarily the other.
No, there's some particularities in each of them. But at the end, it's important to know what type for the caregiver, so they can research and we can do a care plan according to your person. Because when you see one person with dementia, you see one person with dementia. They're all individual. But when you know what type of dementia they had, we can focus on the care plan that is appropriate for that person.
Yeah. Thank you. We've had a couple of questions that come in around the idea of maladaptive behavior we don't like, aggression, pinching, biting, punching. I have lived experience with dementia. My Nana had it, and this was something that she experienced as well through her diagnosis. And questions around strategies for things like maybe those aggressive tendencies, refusal behaviors, or in some cases, some folks, I think one thing we think of fairly commonly is that paranoia or worry that folks who have this diagnosis, where maybe they don't remember where they are or don't trust the people around them anymore. And I'm wondering if you can share some tips or strategies for folks that are supporting people with these more challenging types of behaviors.
Yeah. Well, in terms of, because usually these people are tagged, aggressive.
Yeah.
That's normal. But the normally, stats wise, there's about 5% of people that are aggressive. Most of the time, they have unmet needs. There is something that they try to communicate, and they just can get through because they have an issue. Let's say if they have aphasia, they have a hard time expressing. So they have an unmet need. Often it is pain. 80% of people with dementia aren't pain managed adequately. And I'll give you an example on that one. I think it's worth it to take a minute or so to do it. I know someone that was living in a nursing home, great nursing home. It has nothing to do with the nursing home. The person that was living with dementia had very impaired vision, not only due to the dementia, but other issues. He was normally very, very content and quiet. One morning, he got up and he was agitated. So he was agitated, and often people with dementia might not be able to say where they have pain. So they went through are you in pain? And of course, he might not even understand what pain is at that point. So anyway, the day progressed, he started to grab people. I don't have to tell you, but by the time of the morning, he was pinching people. He was trying to tell them something. So they send him to the hospital under the aggressive banner. It turned out he had pneumonia, urinary tract infection, and he was constipated. If you wouldn't be able to tell people what's going on with yourself, do you think at one point you wouldn't be pinching, or you wouldn't be slapping, or you wouldn't be yelling? Or so I know there's a lot of component in behavior, but I mean that was a good example among so many more, that often it is an unmet need.
Mm-hmm.
And often, as I don't like to say that, but often is us as caregiver that did not have the right approach. Often.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we're not taught how to do this, right? As caregivers,
That's right.
Land in this space where this is our reality now, and we need to do our best to figure it out. So, if only there was a playbook that we could follow. But these opportunities are great to get people engaged and learn more and ask some questions. We do have time for a couple more questions. And so I'm wondering if you can maybe share any insights around if there's medications or treatment opportunities or options for folks that are at various stages of their dementia experience.
Yes, there are medication that can, and I say can, stabilize the disease. It's always recommended to get an early diagnosis, because the medication works better then. However, unfortunately, a lot of the time, the medication has so much side effect that the person cannot tolerate it. If the person can tolerate it, it can work pretty well for a couple of years or so. But sometimes they have to discontinue treatment because it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
It also depends on the type of dementia. Lewy body dementia, unfortunately, the medication doesn't work very well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it goes back to, like you said earlier, understanding that this is what dementia is, and that it's a brain disease. And I really appreciated how you spoke about it as being brain failure. And that's not an easy message to share with a caregiver or with a loved one or a person with a diagnosis. But I find knowing more about what's happening helps you understand the bigger picture and helps you plan and respond better or differently as a caregiver would. And I think one of the folks in the chat was talking about the behavior side, and her family doctor had recommended doing some data collection and tracking some of the behavior. And certainly that's one way for people to at least get a sense of like what time of day or what activity might be triggering some of the behavior, and then how we, similar to what you said before with the visual prompts, how we change how we respond to that person to make sure that they're as successful as possible.
Yeah. And it's not an easy thing to do, but that's such a good one, the recording, to have a book and to go through the days, because sometimes are we putting too much strain on our loved one in mid-afternoon when they've been up all day? Because having dementia, it's like working overtime 24/7, 7 days a week. Mm-hmm. So sometimes a person might need a nap, and then they might end up, often people see a lot of changes towards the end of the afternoon that is often called sundowning. And I just saw something about sundowning, so I'm going to touch on it. So often what we tell people to try is to keep as much light in the house as possible, starting at 3. Now things are coming along, but in December, it can be quite challenging in terms of dealing with someone with dementia. Often the person is not stimulated enough or too much. Again, it's all about getting to know your person. Sometimes it can be a snack at that particular time might help. Some people say, yeah, well, if he eats now, he won't have supper at 5. We might need to change our routine a little to adapt to that individual. Sometimes it might be a good time at 10 to 3, because people will say it's like they knew the time. They know the time, 3 o'clock, there's a trigger. I want to go home. I want to go home. I want to go home. And sometimes when they start an activity to keep them engaged, sometimes next thing you know, it's time for supper.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Maybe what I'll do for one of our last questions is ask, we had some comments and questions in the chat around big transitions, like we can't drive anymore. Mom, you can't drive anymore. Or transitioning from living in your own home independently to long-term care or retirement residences. Things that, we would all struggle with, whether we had a cognitive or brain injury, cognitive impairment, whatever. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of the question around, how do we address those larger transitions, and do we reorient people back to the reality of the situation and say, Katie, you have Alzheimer's disease, it's dangerous, you shouldn't drive anymore? Or do we get creative in how we help with some of those transitions? And is there sort of a rule for that? Or again, is it more individualized?
It is individualized. So again, I'll give you an example. If someone is because they're not all the time, they have lucid period. So let's say with my mom, one day my mom said, well, I'm very sad. Oh, you're sad, huh? Why? Well, grandma hasn't been visiting me. Oh, so I knew she was waiting for her mom. I knew she was not in our time, that she was not lucid. So I approaches, well, maybe she has a hard time getting a ride to come here. And she says, oh, you know what? Yeah. And then she mumble jumble about one of her sister doing something else. And I said, oh my God, grandma was such a nice person, was she? Oh yeah. So we got engaged in a conversation regarding grandma. Next thing you know, poof. Another time she'd say, she was lucid, she'd say, grandma and grandpa, are they gone? And then I would say, yeah. She said, that's what I thought, but my memory is not very good anymore. So you see, she was present. So again, it all depends on the timing. Take a step back and just think, where is my loved one? Where can I connect with my loved one? I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think my sense is that it's so individualized, right? And again, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, there's no easy answer. Unfortunately, this is a complicated diagnosis that presents really unique challenges. So I really love your approach about working with the person and trying to tease out, maybe there's a little piece missing that I can change and I can do something about it. Or maybe from a safety perspective, I know one of the questions that folks asked was, this person needs to go into long-term care, but they're refusing. And then, it's the question of, do we just want them to be happy, or do we want them to be safe? Obviously, we want both, but what's a priority? And sometimes as caregivers, we have to make really hard decisions about the future of our loved ones and what they need from a safety perspective. It's not an easy task. for sure.
Oh, no, absolutely not. In terms of a move in long-term care, and I get that 100%. Sometimes a caregiver need a third person, need a doctor, someone that is a boss, someone that is in charge that can take over and say, and again, sometimes they involve the caregiver, your wife or your loved one is not well, she needs care. There's a waste. What's important is keep in mind that you want to stay an ally to your loved one. So if we say, well, things are getting harder with you, and the person doesn't realize that he or she's sick, well, as we mentioned, they don't see things from somebody else's perspective at all. So often you need other people to get involved.
Absolutely. And I just want to point out a comment that someone made saying it's just as tough on the caregiver as it is for the person with dementia, or sometimes harder. And I think it's important to validate that and acknowledge that absolutely you all have a very difficult job. And like we talked about earlier, there's no playbook, there's no rule book. You don't get handed something from your doctor's office and say, these are the steps you do to make it easier. So I think it's really important to acknowledge all of the caregivers on the call today and the wonderful things that they do for their loved ones, especially when they're waiting for services or trying to figure out, is there a medication? I know there's certain trials and things that are happening right now in the dementia space, medical trials and things like that. So it is definitely not an easy task.
No, and we not we, but sometimes the society tends to say, well, the loved one has dementia, but they're a team, right? They work as a team. So whatever you do for the person with dementia that helps, you're doing for the caregiver, and vice versa. So in your local Alzheimer Society, if you can have support in supporting your loved one, everybody's the winner. Everybody's a leader. So definitely my heart goes out to the people on the platform today that are caregiver giving or a friend and just want to learn more about what it is to live with the disease. Kudos to you guys.
Absolutely, yes. And the Alzheimer Societies in Ontario are wonderful resources. So we definitely encourage folks to check that out. And I think Carol has shared a link to a program we have coming up in February called Scale. And that's a program that we offer for caregivers to support their mental health and well-being. So it would, if you're a caregiver and you're really struggling with difficult feelings like anger and guilt and resentment and stress, which is so common, feel free to check out that program. We want to give you all the support that you need so that you can continue to support the person that you're caring for. So I think we're coming to the end of our talk today, and the comments and questions just keep coming in, and there's been lots of questions around will we have the recording? Absolutely, the full recording will be sent out to people, and I'm so glad for those that found this really helpful, and so we will do our best to get as much of this rich and important information out to all of you as we connect after the talk. So thank you so much, everyone. Someone's asking to repeat the last webinar resource. It's the SCALE program. It's an 8-week program to support caregiver mental health and well-being. And we'll try to include that as a resource for folks as well. Cheryl's saying she did SCALE last year and is very beneficial. So that's great. Thanks so much for the plug, Cheryl. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are just coming to 1 o'clock, and I'm really mindful of everyone's time. So Josée, I just want to thank you again for joining us and sharing so much information and being so open to the conversation and supporting all of these hundreds of caregivers that were on this webinar today. So thank you so much. There was or will be, for those that are still with us, a quick survey that we ask you fill out that will be shared in the chat. And that just really helps us plan for future webinars and know, are we hitting the mark? What can we do to continue to support all of you caregivers? So please take a moment to fill that out now, or we will send that in the follow-up information as well. And for those that would love to join us again for other webinars. Our next one, I believe, that's coming up is on February 3rd. And it's called Caregiving and Eating Disorders, Expect the Unexpected. So another really important and interesting topic for folks. So please feel free to check it out. Go to our YouTube channel, our website. All of our webinars are recorded and on there. So if folks want to check out other things, other tips and strategies, you can do that. So thanks again, Josée. We so appreciate you. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today and asking such thoughtful questions and being so supportive in the chat with each other. We definitely need that these days. So thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. And we'll talk to you again soon. Take good care. Bye, everyone.